to the cloud. Okay, so we are live and we're starting. So hello everybody and welcome to the series, the webinar Zoom series here of we're based in Philadelphia, but we're basically an organization all over the world called Hope for Israel Alliance that we're supporting Israel, fighting against anti-Semitism, and really hoping and trying to do whatever we can to help Israel during these difficult times. So, like I said, my name is Yair, and we're lucky to have Einat Wilf with us today. And I'd like Amy to present and tell us a little bit about Einat. And first of all, Amy is also with me living in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We actually know each other because our kids are together in school. And Amy Zittelman Hirsch is a graduate of the Charles Smith Jewish School in Rockville, Maryland, and she was the president of Blue Hens for Israel during her time at the University of Delaware. But she's also kind of famous in the area. She's kind of a celebrity a little bit because she's in the food industry, and she's a co-founder and the CEO of Soom Foods. And they're basically becoming kind of like a big force here in the Israeli Mediterranean food, and they're very famous with their tahini products, and they're trying to make tahini more of a popular ingredient in the United States. So, but she's also a very big activist, and she's been leading a lot of different initiatives, and it's great to have you here, Amy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yair. Thank you, Einat, for being here. For those of you that might not know much about Einat, you likely all know even more than I do because I feel new to Einat Wilf when my sister Jackie moved here from Shavei Tzion, which is a beautiful moshav between Akko and Nahariya in the northwest Galilee. When the war started, she brought with her and then proceeded to buy a copy of We Should All Be Zionists for everybody in the community, including the rabbi at my synagogue, myself, our families, and really opened my eyes to Einat's, political intelligence, political perspective, direction as it relates to Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and also her perspective on anti-Semitism in the West based off of her role as an intellectual and a scholar. Einat, one of the things that really stuck out to me when I was first reading We Should All Be Zionists was, of course, and I'm sure you did it on purpose, your first chapter about the pound of flesh theory, right? Like this idea of anti-Semitism or this dependency of Western Jewry to have to give up their Zionism in order to fit in when they reach a certain threshold of power here in the States, or at least within a certain community construct. And Yair and the physicians on the main line where we live, around the Philadelphia area, are going through this almost exactly. And when I learned about when you first published this piece, that it was far before October 7th, it really brought into perspective some of the ignorance that I had as a young, naive, Western Zionist. So I say I was the president of Blue Hens for Israel, but Delaware is one of the fourth most apathetic campuses in the country. So to say that I was not exactly dealing with intense advocacy would be an understatement. But we really wanted to bring to you the experience that we're going through here on the main line, the suburbs of Philadelphia, to get your perspective on how this has to do with the growing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and really jump off from there just based off of your intelligence on this matter and your experience debating this subject exactly.
So thank you. About 3 years ago, I was a visiting professor at Georgetown, and one of the courses I taught there was called Zionism and Anti-Zionism, which I'm happy to say, thanks to the vision of one of my students, is now free online as a 5-part course for anyone who wants to take it. So at the end of the course, that same student, she came up to me and she said, "This course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy." And I remember that we engaged in discussions during office hours to try to understand why Jews being exposed to anti-Zionism took such an emotional toll. And the more I spoke with her and also reflected on many of my other interactions, I realized that the rise of anti-Zionism on campus operated like a dynamic of bullying. And this is why I called it the pound of flesh, because in opposition to what Shakespeare wrote, it's the Jews who are actually always demanded to hand over a pound of flesh, mostly metaphorically, sometimes unfortunately real, but mostly metaphorically in the sense of mutilating their Jewish identity in order to fit in order to be accepted. And the reason that the pound of flesh dynamic is one of bullying is that it's relentless. So I sometimes described it as organizations on campus. When I went to study in the United States in the 90s, I could be active in the local kind of pro-Israel chapter, supporter of two states, and that was fine. And then they established J Street and J Street U. And I remember when If Not Now first appeared and JVP. And then it came to the point that if you're not the Jewish militant co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're just not a good enough Jew. And I really remember kind of following this escalating dynamic where it was never enough. It used to be enough to say you're for two states or you hate Bibi or something like that, and that would get you through the door. But because it's a bullying dynamic, what do bullies do, right? If you hand over your lunch money, the bullies don't go home and say, enough is enough, right? The bullies come back the next day and they want more. And this is exactly what I saw with anti-Zionism. It just constantly escalated. And Jews were demanded to participate in what were increasingly basically exorcism ceremonies, like public displays that said, I hate Israel, I'm an anti-Zionist. There was a time when it was enough for Jews to say, I don't care about this issue, I'm not involved with Israel, leave me alone. But again, that's not a situation you can do today. Jews today are demanded to say where they stand. They're not allowed to say that they don't have an opinion or they don't care. And if they want to be accepted to what is called the community of the good, a phrase of David Hirsch, then these are escalating ceremonies, and that's basically the insight that I had, that it is a dynamic of bullying. And my experience with many Jewish students who kind of escaped that toxic dynamic was that each one of them, you actually cannot tell it. Over the years, I was asked by people, how can we tell anti-Zionist Jews what's going on? How can we open their eyes? And I told them, in my experience, you can't. They will have to viscerally experience that moment where all the people I work with all described. I had a similar moment where you basically realize it's never going to be enough, right? You're always going to come back for more. So a lot of the Jews who escaped this toxic dynamic basically had a visceral moment. Everyone describes their own experience where they realized that this is relentless and they're done participating in it.
Well, I also feel like the consequence of that pound of flesh dynamic or that escalation is also we stopped talking about it and stopped talking about it in important places, which ended up putting Jews or Zionists at a disadvantage in the nature post October 7th, right? Everybody else was talking about other things and things that we should have been speaking up about, but because we didn't want to get sucked into it, or we didn't want it to compromise our professionalism or our careers, we chose to stay out of it. I know I did personally. Yair, I'd love for Yair to mention to you what happened at Mainline Health, and why I think that this is a perfect example of this pound of flesh dynamic, this escalation, this like slow boil escalation that caught a lot of us by surprise, but did not catch you by surprise.
I'll say that, I spoke to many Jewish organizations, rabbis, delegations, Hillels, and I don't know if you remember, there was a period for quite a few years where it was like, we're not going to talk about Israel. Israel is a divisive issue. We're not going to talk about it. And at the time, I wrote a lot of essays. I spoke to these organizations. So it was like, bad idea, really bad idea. You have to talk about it. And I remember rabbis, Hillel leaders, they all felt that they somehow could not talk about Israel. And I remember thinking, it's really not hard. Here are some basics, talk about it. But again, the notion, and this is something that the notion that you can run away from it, you can't. And this is also what I write about in The Pound of Flesh. You want to, at one point, just stand your ground, because the thinking that you can escape it, they come running after you. So the sooner you just stand your ground and you say, I'm a Zionist, go away, nothing to look here, the sooner you'll get out of that toxic dynamic.
So this is very interesting, and I'll start, because one of the things that we're trying to do in these webinars and also activist groups all over the country is to not only, talk about how horrible things are, but actually come up with potential strategies and suggestions. And what I'm going to describe now, I'm telling you because I really am curious to see what is your suggestion and how to approach. So, we've known about all the anti-Semitism on campuses. Now the summer, students are no longer in campus, so it's kind of quieted down temporarily. But what we have noticed, not only in the Philadelphia area, but everywhere in the nation, that there's a lot of escalating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in medical health and in medical health facilities all over the country. I personally have joined an organization called the American Jewish Medical Association that started recently in the last year, and they've been doing amazing advocacy work all over the country to help exactly situations like this, patients, physicians, groups, etc. So one of the things that I wanted to tell you is that something that has happened in one of the major greater Philadelphia health systems just recently. They have an organization called DEI, like every other one, and in their newsletter and the publication, the first 2 pages a week ago, there was a big article about basically Gaza, how it's been occupied, and the hospital that was bombarded. Without getting into the details, it was purely an anti-Zionist article that was really, it caused shock within the Jewish community, both of physicians and also patients, because it's a very, very Jewish population that is being served by this medical health. And there's ongoing things with the Federation and maybe writing this and writing letters, etc. But this is one example of something that was so horrible on a macro level. On a micro level, we see in hospitals, including my hospital, people who are woke, progressive, who nonstop on their free time are spreading lies and horrible facts. For example, there is a physician assistant in OBGYN, and her Facebook or Instagram are full of posts of how IDF soldiers have raped Palestinian women, and there's no evidence that the Hamas has ever caused any sexual violence. Now, these are physicians or physician assistants that ultimately will be taking care of people like myself, Israeli, American, and others. And it's very, very difficult for us to know what to do. Now, the most important point is that if you ask them, they'll say, we're not anti-Semite. There's no anti-Semitism. Our best friend, how many times I've heard it? Our best friend is Jewish and my family, blah, 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 blah. And that is some of the things that you're talking about in your podcast and your books. And we just don't know how to deal with this. It's everywhere. It's getting worse by the day. Swastikas in synagogues in the last couple of weeks, signs that are being removed. It's very scary. And yet we hear again, we're not anti-Semites. It's just anti-Zionism. What do you suggest to do? And what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm sure you can talk about it for 2 hours just for that.
I'll start by saying that what I recommend is to take it very seriously. A few years ago, I participated in some high-profile debates as anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. This was before October 7th. This was supposedly like some fringe debate. I lost those debates, because they always bring the Jews. They bring and then you're like, well, it doesn't have to be. And I remember coming back from those debates, especially when I realized that the audience, especially one in London, had a kind of pogrom eve energy when they realized that they won. And I mean, it really felt that they're coming out of this hall to do a pogrom. And I was so troubled, and I thought to myself, but this was not some theoretical debate. One side is arguing for more capitalism, the other, it was not a theoretical debate. So I went home and I started to look into and to research what happens to flesh and blood Jews, actual Jewish people, when anti-Zionism begins to rise. And anti-Zionism, a bit of background, was created mostly by the Soviet Union as this respectable replacement for the discredited anti-Semitism after World War II, but with the same goal, with the same themes of bloodlust and, sinister Jews managing everything behind the scenes and using money to kind of get their countries not to do what the simple people. I mean, the same themes, but now all about Zionism in Israel. Now, I said, okay, let's see what happens to flesh and blood Jews when anti-Zionism rises. And you look in the Arab world in the 40s and 50s that said exactly what you're saying. We love Jews. Our best friends are Jews. We have nothing against Jews. We're only operating against Zionists. But then what do? They blame Jews for being Zionists, and that's it. And they hang them or kill them. And within the 2 decades where anti-Zionism came to dominate the Arab world and the Arab identity, from Morocco to Afghanistan, no Jews were left. And then the Soviet Union, we know the Soviet Union officially said that it doesn't even know that Jews exist, right? They had Hebrews and Jew, like there's no religion in the Soviet Union. And we know how they treated Jews, and but they claimed that it was only against Zionists. And I include stories from Venezuela and from Poland in '68 and Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party and American campuses. They will always, always claim, that's part of how ingenious it is, that their only problem is with Zionists. But the fact is that if it's not stopped, then the environment always turns hostile to Jewish life. And then if it's allowed to continue, no Jews are left. Now, it doesn't always have to be, when I say no Jews are left, you could have various levels. You could have the tough level of the Arab world. You could have Venezuela, where, they're all in Miami now, but the Venezuelan Jewish community is essentially gone. South Africa is probably heading in that direction now. Poland is a heartbreaking story where in '68, there was a wave of anti-Zionism in Poland. And some Jews actually decided to stay in Poland despite the Holocaust, believing in the brotherhood of socialism. And then the Poles were like, oh, we're not against Jews, it's only against Zionism. But they used it, apropos in the medical, they used it to kind of remove Jews from coveted professional and academic positions. And ultimately, all Jews left, some committed suicide. They were not able to just bear the heartbreak of the second persecution. But what I'm saying is, it doesn't matter if your friends are Jews. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter if you individually believe that you want nothing but to fight for rights. You are participating in an ideological process that always ends in the same way. It ends with hostility to Jewish life and no Jews left. And typically it continues with the society itself also suffering. But I care right now about protecting my people. And if you'd like, I'm happy to expand on the mechanism by which it works, the placard strategy, but tell me I can talk about it or.
So I think that, your placard strategy is fascinating, but let's talk first of all about what to do, because what you're describing is very scary. What you're describing is a major existential threat to the Jews, period. Why? Because what you're saying is that from your experience reading history, Arab countries, Soviet Union, etc., whenever you have such a trend of anti-Zionism, that is a threat. And the natural history of it is that the Jews just leave in one way or another. But what do we do when this is everywhere? It's no longer in one country. We have people who are working with from Australia, from New Zealand, from pretty much every country in Europe. In Europe, the situation is pretty bad. United States, Canada. This anti-Zionism is becoming almost a new reality. We hear about it and distortive. It's like the whole reality is upside down. We don't hear anymore about the atrocities of October 7th. We hear about, oh, Gaza was occupied, which wasn't, and this including the DI letter that I showed you, and all these, omissions of the truths and distortion of the truth. And we see that all along. The placard strategy I would love to hear a few words about it, but basically it's kind of like catchphrases that people are associating Israel or Zionism with hateful words, hatred, colonialism, apartheid, all of these horrible things. And it's like almost like a brainwash nonstop. So what do we do? This is exploding all around us. And part of what my last question to you that is going to be related to this, you're talking about the scapegoating. And I'd like you to mention maybe a little bit about that, about how the whole world is basically taking everything is wrong, with Ukraine, Russia, and basically putting it on the heads of the Jews and Israelis.
So this is the moment where I'm not sure I should even talk anymore because I don't have simple solutions. I think it's a great moment of peril for the Jewish people, precisely because of what you described. Anti-Zionism is why we had October 7th. It's the Arab and Palestinian obsession with not allowing Jews to be sovereign in any place, in any way. So yes, you're right. It's gone global. It's scary. And I'll explain it through the placard strategy. The placard strategy is basically the mechanism by which anti-Zionism works. You see it on placards and anti-Israel demonstrations. It's ingenious because on one side it says Israel, Zionism, Star of David, then an equation sign, and then, like you said, a litany of words that actually bear no relation to reality, but they pretend as if they do. And those words, they're chosen not because of reality, they're chosen because they basically, everyone agrees that they're evil. So colonialism, imperialism, racism, and then it escalates. So there's apartheid and then genocide, Nazism. If in America, they'll give it the local flavor of white supremacy. Now, for years, I followed this. The placard strategy is not just on placards, it's in social media and media and academia. You can get a PhD in Zionism as colonialism. It's in the UN. It gets constantly repeated. And after October 7th, a new placard appeared that I didn't see before, which said, keep the world clean. And it had a Star of David in the trash bin. I don't know if you saw it in a few of the demonstrations. And when I saw it, I said, okay, we've reached the final station. Because, I have talks from many years ago where I used the word genocide, was before October 7th. And how did I know? Because I saw that word percolating up. I mean, they were actually trying to insert that word for many, many years. And so someone asked me recently, okay, if you are following the words that are coming up the pipeline, what's the next word? And I told them, no, actually, we've reached the final station. The final station is keep the world clean. And that is the most ancient and most dangerous idea when it comes to Jewish life. It is the idea that there is a clean world out there, a world of utopia, of justice, of equality, of rights. And between us and this world stands the collective Jew, the Star of David. It's one of the most ancient ideas. It's one of the most dangerous ideas. And this is the scapegoating idea, the idea that we could have had such a better life, such a better world. Sometimes people tell me, I don't hate Jews, and they think that anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism is hatred. And I always explain, no, the hatred is the outcome. It's not something that you just come with. Why is the hatred the outcome? Because you are being told you could have better medical care. You could have a better environmental situation. You could have a better, nicer world if it weren't for the collective Jew. That's the classic scapegoating. I have a colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, he said, when people say the new anti-Semitism, and they said it for years, they pretended that there's something new about it. Oh, because, the Arabs are claiming to be the victims of the Jews. He was like, no, that's old anti-Semitism. That people felt to be victims of Jews was about the most basic thing about anti-Semitism, right? Germans thought that they lost World War I because they were stabbed in the back by Jews, that their money was worthless because of Jews. I mean, so you're going to start hating those people because you could have had a better life, and they took it from me. So I think we are in a great moment of peril. I don't have easy solutions. The only message that I bring these days when I talk about it is I say, this is the moment to take care of our people, whatever that means. I mean, this is not the moment to take care of everybody else. And I know it's almost a cringeworthy message. Jews are like, they want to be great allies. They want to repair the world. They want to take care of everyone. And I'm like, not now, not now. Right now, this is the moment to put all our resources, all our abilities, all our organization to taking care of ourselves. And that means, I don't know, it could mean a lot of things, but what's important for me is we need to take very seriously this moment. It is a moment of great peril, and we need to take care of our own. And ultimately, we can't do it on our own. This is why I focus on taking care of ourselves, because fighting this will ultimately have to be the job of the majority of Americans. We'll need to have most Americans, most Canadians, most Brits, most French, those are the 4 communities where most Jews live, rise up to say, this is not America. This is not
Right.
Canada. This is not France. This is not Britain.
And it's the rise up that's so important to me, because polls show that 80% of Americans agree with Israel in this war. I mean, we can debate polls if we need to or whatever. And so, but it's the silence of that majority that's very startling, I think, for us as Jewish people. So how have you seen, I mean, I know in your role through education and through politics, why does it, like, from your experience, why does it start with the most educated? Like, that is what is so confusing to me. And I know that there's historical evidence of that through all anti-Semitism. Early on in the war, I listened to a great podcast, and they brought the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that explained, which I'd never heard explained that way. Anti-Semitism is a reflection of a society's deepest cringes, like the things that they think reflect the worst about them. That's why it's different from culture to culture or from country to country. And so, but the common denominator across most historical evidence of this is that it starts with the most highly educated. It's in, elite colleges. It's in the medical fields. It's not happening in bumblefuck America. You know what I mean? They love Israel. So tell me, why does it happen that way? And what's your perspective on that?
So first of all, you're right. We should not be surprised that it happens that way. For many years, when I would give talks to delegations coming to Israel about the history of what it means to be Jewish and Zionism, and I would talk about Herzl encountering anti-Semitism among his elite, educated colleagues in the University of Vienna. And I told them that one of the problems of discussing anti-Semitism with 21st century people is that everyone's very smug. Everyone thinks that they know that anti-Semitism is clearly bad, and they would have known in real time, right? And I have to convey to them that they would not have known it in real time, because in real time, it actually began among the elites. It was considered a modern, future-looking, scientific, progressive ideology. So, and when people started saying, how is it in the universities? I'm like, do you not know history?
Right.
The fact that anti-Semitism is now supposedly among the deplorables that's precisely the ingenious element of anti-Zionism. It was created purposefully for the academia. It was created for the elites. It was created because the Soviets understood that, so to speak, Hitler gave anti-Semitism a bad name. So anti-Semitism now goes down in society, and the academics, the elites, which are necessary, they're necessary in order to legitimize this idea, they will not be caught dead with Tsarist type anti-Semitism, protocols of the Elders of Zion, still very popular in the Arab world though. But if you create anti-Zionism, and my colleague Isabella Tabarovsky wrote a lot about it, the 5th episode of Zionism and Anti-Zionism is devoted to that. What if the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was only one book? What the Soviets did in the 50s and 60s, they created entire academic disciplines around anti-Zionism, because respectability is required for its success. You needed the church to tell you that Jews killed Christ. You needed science to tell you that Jews are of a different race. You needed universities to legitimize anti-Semitism as a danger to, or Semites, the Jews, as a danger to Europe. And you need the universities. They are the modern churches. You need the universities. You need the UN. You need international bodies so that people can go around and say Israel's committing genocide and actually believe that what they're doing is good.
Let me follow up on that. So just for the audience, we're going to incorporate the Q&A that you're writing throughout the conversation. So I'm going to incorporate, Einat, two questions from two different people now. So one of them is from Daphna, who is a friend and colleague, and she's very big in the community of Greater Philadelphia, arranging a lot of events to bring them home, including she and Michal just arranged a big event this morning, 9 months in a major square in Philadelphia. So Daphna is a physician and she works at Penn. And what she's saying is that what's most difficult for her is to deal with other physicians, college professors, et cetera, who, they participate and they truly believe in what they're saying. And they're saying things that are so, in a way, gaslighting, that are so, the narrative is so distorted. And she does not know how to deal with it on a personal level, talking to these educated, smart people. That's the first question. The second question, I wanted to thank also Jennifer Long, who is one of our Roman Catholic supporters. And she was what she's saying is she has a son who's a freshman in college, and she wants to know, what can he do? He wants to be a strong ally against anti-Semitism. What strategies can she help him to learn and to help the Jewish people with their struggle right now?
Okay. So I'll actually, they work well together because for Daphna, there's only so much you can do alone. And it's a terrible wave where the most educated people, where again, we somehow convinced ourselves that education is some kind of bulwark against it. And it's not. When I tell people, when this starts, and if it's not fought against, it always ends the same way, with the environment turning hostile to Jewish life, and ultimately no Jews are left. And it doesn't matter if even there's Jews who are involved in it, it doesn't matter. It always ends in the same way. And that typically also the societies that engage in it don't come, the Arab world could have done nothing stupider than throw out a million Jews who are some of its most loyal, productive citizens, some of them from communities predating the Arab and Muslim conquests of the 7th century. They could have done nothing stupider, and yet they did it. The Soviet Union could have done nothing stupider than persecute its Jews, and yet it did it. So a part of me understands that we can rationally tell people what's going on, and we can describe and we can show the history, and that is still no protection, because societies sometimes go mad. It actually sometimes happens, even if they ultimately wake up a decade later, and they were like, what just happened and what did we just do? But that's the reason I'm so concerned, and I say this is the moment for the Jews to take care of their own, because we have a timing problem. By the time America wakes up, by the time the world wakes up, how much damage will have been done? So, the West can celebrate, and the Soviet Union can celebrate having won World War II, the Jews not so much. So we have a timing problem where sometimes by the time the world wakes up to the danger, which is much bigger, we have already suffered. So that's why I'm focusing right now on us. But the fact that there is a young man who wants to stand, that's amazing. And I mean, I think he'll benefit a lot from educating. And like I said, I have all my material about Zionism, about the conflict. But beyond any of those things, I think the best thing he can do is not to stand with the Jews, is actually to go back to non-Jewish Americans and tell them, this is not America. This is not who we are. And I think it is far more important to go in that direction, to create more and more non-Jews who are saying, we're sorry, but this is not America, and we're not going to let it happen here.
Yeah, it's so compelling. I mean, I understand the community. Yeah, or maybe take a question if you want, because I so desperately want to talk about the war of return, which is like a very hard left turn from focusing on anti-Semitism in the West. So, but I really want to be respectful of the community, because we have a lot of people writing in about what ultimately feels hopeless here. And I, again, want to remind people, not that I'm leading this, that 80% of Americans do agree with Israel here. I think that there, is a strong opportunity, like Einat is talking about, to reach out to our allies that are afraid to speak up and focus on what is American and what is un-American in these circumstances. And so can you speak to, I'll ask one of the questions from the chat, and then maybe I'll get to ask you, everybody should pick this up about the war of return. We'll bring it up in a little bit. But can you share with us your experience where you've seen the tides turn? And was it like even on a small level or on a louder level, because you've been around it and have been more cognizant of it than I think many listening in today, where you've seen who has spoken up and how it's worked and what has helped the tides not turn towards despair?
So I'll take it in two levels, and that will also tie us to the war of return.
Mm.
So for many years, people have asked me, okay, you're telling us that this is the arc and it always ends in the same way.
Right.
Do you have a story where like they fought back and it didn't happen? So for many years, I actually brought the example of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, is your classic who really, really believes he's not an anti-Semite, only anti-Zionist, really the classic left-wing Soviet fighting racism. He really doesn't understand it because it's so baked in. But within days of him taking over the Labour Party, it became a cesspool of a hostile environment to Jewish members of parliament, to Jewish activists. And the good story that I had to tell for years, that the British Jews, who unlike American Jews, like to not, for no one to know that there are Jews, and they tend to actually be very British about it. They realized that if Jeremy Corbyn will be prime minister, and he was close to that, this is the end of Jewish life in Britain. Like, it was very clear to them that it's heading in that direction. And they actually came out, Jews who no one knew were Jews, and they spoke up and they organized. And ultimately, the Labour had its worst defeat in, I don't know, about 90 years. And we got Keir Starmer, who was working on changing the Labour Party. So for many years, I told that as a good, feel-good story. And then a British person, I don't know, a few weeks ago in a talk said, Einat, I'm not sure we can pocket that win yet. Kind of, I'm not sure that in Britain we can just rest assured and say, okay, we've beat this back. But it is, at least it's a good, let's say, interim story. Okay, they understood the danger. They fought against it. The bigger story that I find these days is the change in some parts, small, but it's actually almost more important in the Arab world, where you have the war of return is essentially the story of understanding that the conflict with the Arabs, but especially with the Palestinians, has always, unfortunately, been about the very existence of a Jewish state, that it's never been about occupation or settlements or Gaza or Bibi, or like that. It was always singularly for over a century about a singular Arab vision that the Jews have no right to self-determination. They cannot be sovereign. They cannot be equal in this land. And the book talks about the various mechanisms by which this operates, such as UNRWA and the perpetual refugeehood, but ultimately it's about this singular element in the conflict. And the source of hope is that even though it's small, it's minor. For the first time ever, we have Arab voices that are speaking up for Jewish self-determination. If I'm going to say if there's been any ray of light in the last few months, it's been the dozens of Arab, Muslim, and ex-Muslim voices who have spoken up. And in many ways, they speak up more confidently than Westerners or even Jews, because they actually know what the conflict is about. So they knew it was never about occupation or settlements or baby. They knew that it was always about the rejection about Jewish sovereignty. So they can speak to it. I was recently at a conference in DC, and before me spoke Luwayan al-Sharif. He's Emirati, Saudi. He dresses, you always see him dressed in full Arab garb, and he was speaking to Jewish educators. And he was telling them, look, I get the stories of persecution, but ultimately, you have to tell the story of your historic connection with the land of Israel.
Mhm.
You are in this land not because of persecution. You are in this specific land because this is your historic homeland. And right, this is an Arab telling Jewish educators that they need to get their story straight, right? That they need to actually that the real story is the story of the historic connection.
Mhm.
So we have voices like his. We have, I just did a podcast with Yasmin Muhammad, with the Muslim, the apostate. So you have ex-Muslims, Muslims, Arabs, one and a half Palestinians who are really finally speaking up, and they speak with more clarity than any Westerners and sometimes than any Jew that
Mhm.
work.
So we're going to go, Amy is going to dive a little bit into the book, the war book, but a couple of comments and one question from Hadass. So the comments are, Einat, multiple people are asking about your course. How do we actually watch your course, log in? How does it work exactly? They'd love to, I think many of the audience here would like to watch it. Is there any specific link?
Yes, you can just do my name, Einat Wilf, Zionism and Anti-Zionism. It's on the Tikva website. Just log it, just go in. You'll need to give your email. If they ask you for a donation, you don't have to. It's free. The course
You
is
should.
free. And it's five episodes of 40 minutes each, all beautifully produced by Zoe, my student.
One more comment that I wanted to make. We're actually proud to have on this webinar as one of the audience, Yael Halas, Dr. Halas, she is the founder and president of the American Jewish Medical Association. And they have been doing a lot of amazing work, like I said, in the last year. And she just reminded everybody, any physicians, nurses, PAs, therapists, please go to the website of AJMA. We need a strong lobby. It makes a big difference. AJMA and log. There's many, many members. Now I'm going to go and ask one question before we go to Amy's going to talk a little bit about the book and several questions that she prepared. Hadass, basically, I'm going to read her question because it's important. She has been seeing the struggle inside one of Philadelphia's largest newsrooms. Managers have been fighting with her specifically when she was working there about labeling anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. No, it's not. And she says, yes, it is. And eventually she was laid off without any good reason. Her main concern right now, and we see this, her main concern is that because of this and other reasons, people who are high up, Jewish people, are a little bit afraid or a lot afraid to stand up against management. We see this even in the case of the hospitals. If we see something, it's hard for us as employees to go to the CEO, bosses, president, hey, this is anti-Semitism, you're getting it all wrong, because people are afraid. So bottom line, she summarized by saying that Jews are not able to speak up. She's concerned that Jews are not able to speak up and heard, especially in influential industries. What do you have to say in response?
First of all, it's true. And again, the reason that I emphasize the arc of history is because Jews were not able to escape it. A lot of Jews across the Arab world, across the Soviet Union, they had nothing to do with Zionism, and yet none of them are still living there because that's it. It was impossible to stay there. So the notion that you can somehow spare yourself never worked before. So I actually think it's the opposite. The sooner you stand up, the sooner there's a chance that everyone will be spared. But If you think you're going to spare yourself and throw everyone under the bus, that was also part of the pound of flesh idea. The idea that I can throw Israel under the bus, I can throw Zionism under the bus, I will be spared. And the reason that I emphasize the bullying dynamic is that it's relentless. No one gets spared. But I know there's a lot of cowardice. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of losing. Like, no one believes. I mean, people can listen to me, but I know that nobody believes me, in the sense that nobody believes that it will really be that bad. So let's just let this wave pass and, keep our high up jobs, and it will be okay. But I don't have a story where that works out this way, where it kind of just passes and things go back to normal without the country rising up, without people saying enough is enough. But I will say, rather than what I've said to one student that worked with me, is I told her, you know what, stop with the whole anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and because it becomes this hair-splitting theoretical debate. Just let them know, show them the mechanism, tell them what's at work, and tell them that it always ends in the same way. Now, here I have to say, I found two responses. In some places, it was very effective. Administrators, like on college campuses, who were alerted to what's going on, that anti-Zionism always ends with no Jews. And is that what you want? Do you want your campus free of Jews? So here I have two divergent reviews. One, some people said that was really effective. It really helped people wake up to what's going on. And some people said that's actually what they want. We go back to Poland in 1968, anti-Zionism, and then Germany in the 1930s, anti-Semitism were wonderful means by which to remove Jews from highly coveted professional positions. So it actually worked that way to remove Jews from that place, which is, again, why I understand the fear. I understand, but there's no story whereby putting your head down actually ever worked.
From your experience, I mean, in one of your podcasts, Einat, and as many people mention, you talk about the fact that Jews are the most self-critical, right? Like, no one is going to debate Israel's policies more than Israelis, and nobody is going to debate like the nature of Jewish values than Jews. And so, can you talk about your experience seeing Jews take on this subject, and Jews that might lean towards anti-Zionism, if not explicitly be so? What is the deal with that, and what is the best way for them not to be tokenized as a representation of the Jewish people?
So it goes to, first of all, it's a permanent feature of Jewish life. Going back to the medieval debates, right? There was all these medieval debates, Judaism versus Christianity. Who were defending Christianity and blaming Jews? They were always converts, right? So the idea that Jews are like placed at the forefront of claiming that everything's okay, nothing's wrong, we only want what's good for you, that is a permanent feature of Jewish life. There was always a market for that. There were always Jews who responded to that. And one of the reasons is precisely that pound of flesh dynamic, because there is this very attractive, you will be platformed. What does it mean to tokenize? It means to give you a platform. You will get accolades, you would get awards, you will get professorships. You will be the head of the Holocaust studies if you say that Israel's committing genocide. So there's a lot of reward to being that kind of Jew. And it's a lot of work to not be that kind of Jew, So it is very attractive. You always have Jews who will fall into that. The pressure is relentless. It's a permanent feature of Jewish life. When I gave a talk a few months ago in Israel, someone told me something that I didn't know. He said that in the Soviet Union, there were very famous Jewish actors, Jewish dancers, Jewish artists who would go on television and would explain that anti-Zionism is not against Jews. Turns out that when everybody left, once the Soviet Union fell, as soon as they could get out, many of those actors and artists moved to Israel. And they had to do a whole mea culpa round to explain to their fellow Jews who all immigrated together, right? So the notion that you would be spared, ultimately they were all together. They had to go through this whole mea culpa and say, the regime was, the Soviet government was holding our families, they were threatening our livelihood, all that stuff. And it took a while for people to forgive them, he told me. What would be the excuse of the Jews that seem to be doing it willingly now? But I understand it's the same dynamic, maybe not officially, maybe your family's not being held or your job is not officially threatened, but the people who are not speaking up have a very clear sense of their jobs being threatened.
This is fascinating, today, Einat. There's so many questions coming both on the chat and on WhatsApp, but I'll try to. So I apologize if we're not going to make it to all of the questions, but a couple of questions that are both charged and a little bit related. So one question is, with everything that you're describing that is happening in the world, are we reaching a tipping point where do you think you expect people from the United States, from Australia, et cetera, to start moving more to Israel because the situation is becoming kind of very difficult and it's maybe even going to get worse? And the second question that is more specifically for Jews who are living here in the United States, and several people sent me personal messages. We're talking about anti-Semitism in the United States, and you're saying we have to really be involved in what's happening here. And I can tell you that I've been on so many different chats and groups and meetings. The Jews don't know, and this is internal politics in the United States, what to do. They feel that on the right side, you have the traditional white supremacist, Charlottesville, et cetera, anti-Semitism. On the left side, though, which is becoming more of an issue in the last year, you have the woke, the progressive, the squad, the universities, everything that we described about the health system, et cetera. What to do, how to direct our attention. So again, two charged questions.
Okay, so I'll start with the last one because it's also relevant for France, for Britain. The golden age where we had politics that suited us perfectly in those countries has probably come to an end. And we are, as they say in Hebrew, we have to choose between pestilence and cholera, right? The plague and cholera. We need we can't be as picky as we could in better times about who we work with. I sometimes compare it to the Nazis and the Soviets, they both were terrible, but we needed one, at one point we needed one more than the other. So I think that's part of understanding that this is a moment of great peril. It's part of understanding that a lot of things are very comfortable, very convenient. We could basically just have the political party, the politics we wanted. That's probably not available for a while. And that's also very Jewish, the notion of being politically homeless. That's also how it often starts. It's politically homeless, and then it's other kind of homeless, which gets me to the first question. The truth is, I don't know, because this is a moment of global peril. People are leaving Israel. People are coming to Israel. Which is why I wish that's why I said that's the moment that I'm not sure I should talk anymore, because I wish I could say, okay, everyone, there are these bunkers in New Zealand, we're all going there, it's all set up, let's go. I don't know where and what is the place. I know that we're entering a period of great peril where we will need to protect our own, where we will need to stand up and fight for ourselves. We will need to be very sophisticated about how we work with allies, rather than just think that we can just choose the perfect allies that match us. They're a perfect match in every way. It's a completely different mindset. And, one of the arguments I have here in Israel is that I see so many of our political leadership, our military leadership in all phases, everyone wants to go back to October 6th to just, if we can close down this thing. And I call it, like Stefan Zweig, the world of yesterday. That world is gone. And I understand the desire to just get back to it and let this wave pass. That world is gone. And we're entering, I don't know if it's uncharted territory, but we're entering some very perilous water here. And the most I can say is that this is a good time for all Jews to have some options.
So thank you, by the way, because that is a slight bridge, I guess, to talk about the war of return and also beyond the conversation of whether anti-Zionism or that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There's still the debates of what's going on in Israel and the day after that are emerging in conversations. And your perspective on the primary issue being the right of return is one that was unique to me, since kind of understanding what has been discussed in ceasefires or in peace negotiations in the past, and like what is being discussed now. Your hypothesis, if I were to summarize it, is that this all really rests on there is no zone of potential agreement here, that the Palestinians have explicitly said since the creation of Israel that it is all or nothing, that all refugees are going back. Can you talk to us about the initial refugee crisis? I mean, what was so compelling to me in your book was the idea of how many people became refugees after World War II, right? In the 1948, in the decades after, there were many borders being changed. There were many people being passed between ethnic and cultural identities to settle back within where they are, quote unquote, meant to be. So can you talk through that, and what are the negotiating pieces that have been discussed in the past, and what you feel or might even know are being discussed now with this ceasefire and the potential for a two-state solution?
So the story Adi Schwartz and I tell in the book is ultimately the whole idea of the Palestinian perpetual refugeehood, their demand for something called a right of return that is not a right or not a return, but they demand it. Those are ultimately just symbols of the more underlying element of their refusal to accept a Jewish state and any borders.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell the story that there's actually nothing special about the creation about a Jewish state. I have a colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, he says Zionism is normal. The idea of a people wanting self-determination in their homeland, this is the normal process of the 20th century. Anti-Zionism, this obsession with Jews not being sovereign, that's abnormal. The vilification of Jews, that's a theological obsession. Zionism is normal. What does it mean? It means that the entire 20th century is the transition from empires to states, when lucky, nation states. This is a process that was bloody. It involved 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, civil wars. Like you said, empires disappeared, new states were established, new borders were delineated. Tens of millions of people, Hindus and Muslims and Germans and Ukrainians and Poles and Bulgarians and Jews, all became refugees in this process. And the message to all of them was tough, tragic, but this is it. You move on. Wherever you are, that's where you continue, or somewhere else. But there's no going back. There's no going back physically, no going back in time. This is the march of history. The Arabs, so the creation of Arab refugees in war, there was nothing unique about it. The one thing that was unique about it is the fact that the Arabs went to an unnecessary war, right? They went to a war against the establishment of a Jewish state. We could have celebrated 76 years of an Arab state and a Jewish state living side by side in peace, but no, it was more important for the Arabs, and they declared it. It was more important for them that the Jews will not have a state than that they would have their own. They failed. Refugees were created in the process, Jewish refugees, Arab refugees. The Jews were absorbed by Israel. The Arab refugees themselves refused to move on because they knew that if they moved on, the Jewish state gets to live. And from their perspective, that was unacceptable. And they have essentially maintained it to the present with the acquiescence of the world through this mechanism of UNRWA, where they basically kept alive the idea that the war of 1948 has never been over, right, and that one day it will be won to their cause of no Jewish state. And what's important for people who are discussing it or debating it is that the Palestinians don't lie when it comes to this. They've learned to use words like justice or rights or 2 states, where we made the crazy assumption that when Arabs or Palestinians said 2 states, one of the 2 was Jewish. But in retrospect, we should have checked, because they meant an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab state to replace Israel through this mechanism of, they're not refugees, but this mechanism of settling in Israel millions of Arabs. So but when you probe and you ask, they actually don't lie. They don't lie that fundamentally their opposition is to Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. As you know, the book has a quote that I've been using ever since in all my talks. It's a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He needs to explain why Britain failed to carry out the promise given unanimously by the League of Nations to the Jewish people to achieve sovereignty in the land. And he basically says, and this is February 47, there's no settlements, there's no occupation, there are no refugees, there's no Gaza, there's no Bibi, like all the excuses don't exist. And he says, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. He calls it irreconcilable in February 47. And he says, look, in the land, there are Jews and Arabs. The Arabs are those that will later take the name Palestinians. He says, and each one of them has a top priority. The Jews' top priority is to establish a Jewish state. So basically, normal principle of self-determination for the Jewish people. And he says for the Arabs, the top priority, those are the Palestinians, their top priority is to resist to the last establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. So he basically says the reason this conflict is irreconcilable is because the Jews want a state and the Arabs, Palestinians, want the Jews not to have a state. That's irreconcilable. And here I'll bring it together with anti-Zionism. The tragedy, the danger, is that because the Arabs were waging a total war against Jewish sovereignty, what they found already in the 1930s is that they can always find collaborators among the world's anti-Semites and anti-Zionists at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 30s and 40s, they enjoy a very fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, the Pan-Arabists turn anti-Zionism and Palestinianism into their top priority. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, it's the Soviets who really take Palestinianism global, using Palestinianism as the mask to insert into the UN Zionism as racism and the entire placard strategy. And now it's Iran. And this again brings me to why this is a moment of peril, because the good news is that I have no doubt that the Ayatollah regime in Iran will find itself in the same dustbin of history as the Nazis, Pan-Arabists, and Soviets. But of course, the bad news is that on the way to the dustbin of history, they create a lot of damage to the Jews and some global mayhem. And again, the reason that I view this as a great moment of peril, because I wonder, are we beyond the peak point of the global mayhem and the damage to the Jews? Or are we just in the beginning of it? But Palestinianism has always been this respectable way to take anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism global. You're not anti-Semitic, you're not anti-Zionist, you're just for Palestinian rights. And that's how it works together. And again, that's why it's so dangerous.
Yair, do you have a question?
No, you can take the next question as well.
Okay. So can you explain a little bit then, is there concrete data of how many refugees are in this zone of potential agreement? What percent of the occupation of the West Bank needs to, what really are the terms that have been negotiated over the years, and which were debatable and which were non-starters, really, on both sides, from your experience?
So a very senior American negotiator recently said in a closed briefing that reflecting on 30 years of negotiations, he has to admit that there were actually never negotiations.
Right.
What was Israel offered and Arafat said no. And Israel offered more and Arafat said no. And Israel offered more and Abu Mazen said no. And Israel got out of the Gaza Strip and they turned it into a weaponized landscape to liberate Palestine. So He said that there was actually never negotiations in the sense of what you asked, trying to agree on the borders, the refugees. And the reason is that fundamentally, whenever Palestinians were faced with a choice, and like human beings, societies, you discover societies at moments of decision. That's when you really know who you are, when you actually have to choose. So whenever they had to choose between having an Arab state, a Palestinian state, for themselves, dignity, freedom, but the Jews will also have a state to date. And for the last century, they have chosen to say no, to walk away, and always to follow it up with violence. So anything where you're saying the zone of disagreement, anything that keeps the Jewish state is a non-starter for them. And anything that kills the Jewish state is a non-starter for us. Hence, Bevin called it irreconcilable, which is why you talked about the day after. The only vision that creates peace, if we take that word seriously, with allowing the Jewish state to live, is if the Arabs, and especially the Palestinians, go the way of the Abraham Accords and finally decide that an Arab and Muslim identity does not have to be obsessively anti-Zionist. It can actually live next to a Jewish state rather than mobilize all its resources to its destruction. That's the only way we get to peace. That is, in my view, the essence of this war. This is the day after. That's the thing that we need to make clear. We need to make it clear. That's much of my criticism domestically within Israel, that our leadership has just not been sophisticated to realize that Palestinians are our best allies and that they don't lie, and to call them out on that morning, afternoon, and night, to say every day, the day that Palestinians end their century-long war against Zionism, the day that they develop a constructive vision of wanting to live next to a Jewish state rather than this destructive vision of no Jewish state, the day that they understand that this explicitly means that they are not refugees and that there's no such thing as a right of return into the state of Israel, that's the day that they will always find us as partners for peace, ready to live side by side in two states, but not a minute before. And I think that's the thing that a more sophisticated Israeli leadership would have constantly said.
So this leads to the next question that, we belong, Amy, myself, others belong to different groups, Israelis, American Jews, Europeans, Australian, etc. And we are all trying to support Israel. There's no doubt, and fight anti-Semitism, support in Israel. However, many people, including people who texted me personally, are asking, there's a confusion. Let's say I live in the United States. There's a confusion within the Americans. We want to support Israel, but yet what we see from Israel, especially on Shabbats, on Saturday nights, we see something that is very hard for us to grasp. And I'm not talking about the Palestinian side, I'm talking about the Israeli side. We see people, like just a couple yesterday, actually, hundreds of, I don't know how many thousands, marching to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, and basically saying, protesting against the government. We hear people who are talking about how can we support the government of Israel when people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, we all know that he has this picture, maybe he took it down temporarily, big picture of Baruch Goldstein. He is very proud of taking his kids for every bar mitzvah to the grave of Baruch Goldstein, who is, he's a mass murderer who went to a religious Muslim place and basically killed dozens of people. These are some of the people, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who believe, kind of like how the Palestinian wants from the river to the sea, they believe that it is all ours, and whatever needs to be taken, action, kick them out, kill them, etc. How do we people support this type of government when we have such extreme fanatic people on the government? So I know it's a charged question, but I wanted to ask your opinion.
Nothing I haven't been asked before. No, of course, you don't need to support this particular Israeli government. This is why I separate between the big ideas and the specific issues. This is why I go back to Bevin, because why are Smotrich and Ben-Gvir ultimately, I mean, I think they're terrible for Israel on the diplomatic front, on the domestic front. I mean, they're just terrible all around. But I can assure you that if they were out of government, we would come exactly 0 steps closer to peace. And this is why I emphasize the difference between why there's no peace. There's no peace because even with territories, without territories, with occupation, without occupation, with settlements, without settlements, with Bibi, without Bibi, with Gaza, without Gaza, the Palestinians remained consistent. No change in their view that there should be no Jewish state. There's actually no moment that you can show that a specific Israeli action turned Palestinians into saying, oh, okay, now we want to live next to a Jewish state. There's actually no such moment. You know, there's someone from the left who constantly badgers me on Twitter, and he says, Einat, is there anything that would lead you to say that Israel is the reason we don't have peace? And I said, yes, if we had 1 billion Jews. We had 1 billion Jews, fine. I'll accept the blame. As long as we're 7 million, we're not the problem. And that's the most foundational issue. We are, as long as we care about being sovereign in the land of Israel, we are destined or damned, choose your word, to remain a tiny, puny, minute, ethnic, religious, linguistic, national minority in an Arab and Muslim Middle East that, despite what I said, is still overwhelmingly mobilized for our non-existence, which is why historically, right-wing governments, left-wing governments always agreed to compromise. Not because we're nice. Don't make it about Jewish values or being nice. The reason we've always agreed to compromise from 37 to 47 to 67 to 2000, 2008, and many more in between is because we are keenly aware of our minority status in the region. Even big, bad, evil Netanyahu, when he was offered a choice, and remember, you reveal yourself in choices. He was offered a choice: forgo any notion of annexing the West Bank. You get direct flights to Dubai, you get normalization. He chose normalization, and Israelis were thrilled. So yeah, maybe there were 5 settlers, maybe Ben-Gvir among them and Smotrich, who said, oh, this is terrible, we've lost the opportunity to annex the West Bank. But most Israelis were thrilled with that choice because, again, that goes back to the foundation. Israelis are focused on statehood, on sovereignty. Smaller, bigger, that's secondary to the idea of sovereignty. That is the one non-negotiable. So again, I don't like these people. Like, for example, a few weeks ago, Netanyahu went all like, you know, with his baritone, I prevented a Palestinian state. And I remember tweeting, it's not nice to take credit for the one achievement that the Palestinian national movement actually has. You prevented nothing. The Palestinians have never pursued a state. If they had pursued statehood, they would have had it 80 years ago. They pursued no Jewish state. That's why that's why Gaza looks like it is. That's why we have war, because it was more important for them to weaponize the entire landscape of Gaza, to turn it into an integrated war machine, to liberate Palestine from Jewish sovereignty, rather than to actually finally build something for themselves.
If I could say one personal thing before Yair wraps us up, early on after October 7th, not a colleague, somebody that I knew through business asked me to talk. And it's interesting. I started the conversation on one note. Do you believe Israel has a right to exist? Because if you don't, I'm just not talking.
As the Jewish state.
Yeah, it's a Jewish state, exactly. If you don't, there's no conversation to be had. There's no debates to be had. So what I reflect on this is that question exactly. When we're talking to our allies or we're talking to non-Jews or non-Zionists, the question to them is, do you think Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state? If you do, let's engage in dialogue. If you don't, there's no room for this in our American values, you know? So this was really, really really impactful on me and my future conversations. Thank you so much, Einat.
Certainly.
And it's been very impactful for all of us. And I'll just finalize by saying that this was really powerful. And what I always try to take, kind of a lesson and what needs to be done. And people here heard it a million times. I was co-raised by my mother, my grandmother. My grandmother is still alive. She's 96. She was in her teens when she was in Hungary. And she remembered the anti-Semitism dripping slowly in healthcare. It's kind of like what we're experiencing. And people are saying, oh, yeah, it's going to be okay. It's a wave that shall pass. Next thing she knows, she's in front of Dr. Mengele, lost all of her family to the gas in Auschwitz. And I think that what you're saying is that this is great peril. Hopefully this will improve, but we have to take responsibility and we have to take action, and we can't just sit down wherever we are in society, in the United States, in Israel, in Australia, in Europe, and just let it be. We have to stand up to all this anti-Semitism. So, Einat, any last comments? And, maybe if we're lucky enough, maybe we can have you again on the, this webinar. It's really important, your insights.
Thank you. Always with pleasure. As I said, I'm available. The war of return is, I think this is the one comment we get from most books, for most readers, is that if you're going to read one book to understand the conflict, this is it. We Should All Be Zionists really traces the rise of anti-Zionism and what it means, the course on Zionism and anti-Zionism. So there's a lot of material. I know a lot of people since October 7th have been educating themselves feverishly. We need that, I think, more than anything, first of all, for our mental well-being. I told you here that sometimes I fear that I should not talk. I gave some talks a few months ago, and at one point I told them, look, I don't think I should continue. Everyone wants inspiration and optimism, and I don't have that right to. And I said, look, at least all I can say is this is my understanding of what's going on now. Maybe that would be of value. And when I went down, some people went up to me and they said, you think it's not optimistic, it's not inspirational, but it's one of the most inspiring things we've heard in a while, because finally we don't feel we're crazy. Because everyone tells us, and we think the world has gone upside down, and everyone tells us that, it's not. And so if nothing else, it helps to know we're not crazy.
Einat, Amy, toda, everybody for attending. We will send this recording later on to whoever registered, and hope to see you soon again. And Am Yisrael Chai.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.
Toda raba.
Toda.